Sultan Bathery, India is a place that's got an unusual mix of both the old and the new, ancient and modern. Cut into the wild jungle are patches of farmland, little towns bustling with people, and even temples built hundreds of years ago by ancestors that no one can name anymore. In one of these little patches lived Thadathil Prajesh on his dairy farm. He'd inherited the business from his father, as his father did before him, and he liked his hard-working yet simple life very much. He was just far enough out of reach that the busy lives of the townspeople didn't bother him, and his quiet little family too much. Here was where Thadathil woke up to the surrounding wilderness where he was born 36 years ago. He'd spent his childhood working on the farm and playing in the trees and the waterfalls within walking distance from his house, the same house that he was now raising his own children in. He woke up every morning to the sounds of the cows in the pen and the birds out in the wild. Every morning, he got into his Jeep and drove out to do the morning chores while his wife prepared breakfast. Then, at around noon, he returned for lunch before heading out to the very edge of the farm. And there he spent the next hour or two of his day cutting down grass for his cows. He loaded his Jeep until it nearly overflowed. The grass kept the cows occupied until the next morning, until he started the ritual all over again. It was the 9th of December, 2023, and Thadathil went about his morning routine like he did every day before. His wife woke him with a cup of hot chai, and by the time she'd started cooking breakfast while nursing a fussy and teething baby, he was already starting up the Jeep. After the busy morning was behind him, he returned home for lunch and enjoyed a few minutes with his children, making the baby laugh and teaching his two older boys how to make slingshots out of some rubber cut from an old tire and a few good Y-shaped branches that he cut down for them. He left the boys to their target practice and set out in his trusty Jeep again to go and collect his herd's fodder. Thadathil drove for 10 minutes before stopping right at the edge of the tree line, but something was already waiting for him. He didn't know it, but for the past 4 days, the farmer had been watched closely by a male Siberian tiger from inside the jungle. The observant cat noticed that the man had a system that he followed religiously. He'd cut grass, load the Jeep, and when he returned the next day, Thadathil started cutting grass right next to the spot he'd last cut from. That way, he systematically cleared every square inch around his farm in increments, and by the time he'd come full circle, the place he'd started at had a fresh new patch of grass growing for his cows again. Every day that he returned, the cat was waiting in front of the section where he'd be working. Sure enough, like clockwork, Thadathil arrived and cleared a few feet of growth with his scythe, right in front of the tiger watching from the trees. After clearing some growth, he sat down with his back to the trees and started making bundles that he tied with blades of grass before loading them into the back of his Jeep. The predator waited until the man placed the scythe on top of the vehicle. The animal wasn't stupid. It knew very well that this seemingly primitive tool was incredibly dangerous. If that long blade could slice through grass and bush as smoothly as it did, it would slice through a living animal too. So it waited patiently until the potential weapon was well out of the human's reach before it started to slink out of the bushes from where it was hiding. Thadathil was whistling a nursery rhyme he'd learned as a boy, lost in his thoughts and the task at hand. All the while, the animal crept up closer and closer behind him. Its paws were silent as they sidestepped the sticks and leaves that littered the ground. Its shoulders were hunched, ready to pounce. With a final twitch of its tail, the beast let out a roar that sent the birds in the nearby trees into the air. Thadathil turned sharply at the sudden sound, and to his horror, the tiger was already right above him. Its extended claws were held wide, and its jaws were already open as it fell on top of him. Thadathil was pounded onto his back, and the pair of them skidded over the ground, leaving a groove in the earth as they went. The beast was aiming for his throat, but Thadathil turned around just as it landed on him, so its teeth sank into the man's face instead. Vicious and frenzied, the animal shook its prey. Thadathil screamed as his skin was torn from his skull. One of the tiger's claws was tearing through his back, and the other was hooked into the space between his shoulder and neck. Desperately, Thottothil clawed at the massive animal on top of him, but all his hands managed to get a hold of were clumps of orange and black fur. It wasn't the bite on his head that killed Thottothil. It was the single nail that managed to embed into his neck. The femoral artery was punctured, and he bled out, but not before the skin on his face was entirely ripped off the bone. When the man finally went limp, the tiger dragged him into the midst of the trees where it could eat in peace, with no fear of any more humans coming along to disturb it. Thottothil's wife knew something was wrong when night fell, and her husband hadn't returned for dinner. She didn't waste time trying to search for him in the dark. With 3 young children in tow, she called the authorities and every neighbor in the vicinity. The search party found the jeep almost immediately. The pool of blood on the ground next to a bundle of grass shimmered in their torchlights. From there, it didn't take them long to find Thottothil's remains just a few feet from the car. He'd been decapitated, and his left leg was gnawed off entirely. There were shreds of ginger and black hair embedded under his nails. For the next 3 days, while the Prajesh family prepared for his funeral, authorities tried to track the tiger. By the size of the paw prints, they were certain that they were looking for a fully grown male, but they just couldn't track where the beast went in the thick overgrowth of the jungle. But everyone in the area knows that once a tiger kills a human, it always comes back to bring more people to their terrifying final affliction. Crocodile National Park in North Australia is a protected park of sorts. People aren't allowed to hunt or farm in the area, but locals still go fishing and out for picnics without a guide or the need for a permit. The animals inside are protected by law, but it's still open for people to move in and out without hindrance. And for the most part, this has always worked out well. By encouraging the public to appreciate nature, they are incentivized to protect it, not to destroy. Through Crocodile runs Crocodile River, named after, you guessed it, the huge amounts of saltwater crocodiles that infest the waters. The crocodiles in that river are one of the few success stories of nature conservation. By the middle of the 19th century, they were critically endangered, and in just 20 years, they were brought back from the brink, a victory that the locals are fiercely proud of. It's a popular spot for visitors to take pictures and to view the fearsome creatures in their natural habitats. The locals make a game of giving the oldest crocs names and pointing them out to day tourists. In the years, people have petitioned to put a bridge over Crocodile River, but authorities deemed it a waste of money. Before you judge them too harshly, they actually had a point. Locals ride their dirt bikes and fish in those waters every day, and despite the numerous signs put up to warn them of the dangers in the current, they walk around in the shallows as they cast their lines in for fish, sometimes even taking a swim to cool off from the midday heat. Say what you want about the Aussies, they're tough as nails. You don't grow up in the land down under, where every other thing wants to kill you, without growing hair on your teeth. A bridge would have been a waste of taxpayers' money, since no one would have used it anyway. There were more than enough warnings, and everyone knew what they were walking into if they really wanted to. Crocodile holds another title, other than just being one of the biggest crocodile populations in the country. It's also where the movie Crocodile Dundee was filmed all those years ago. But in March 1987, it would become famous for something other than being the grounds for one of the best Aussie cinematic gems to grace our screens. It became the scene of one of the most brutal attacks in the river's history, and one that still haunts the witnesses to this day. On that day, Kerry McLaughlin took his son out for some father-son fishing. Their parked car at the picnic area was soon joined by another vehicle containing 6 American tourists. When they saw the two fishing, one of the visitors, Everett Galbraith, took a few snapshots of the pair. Everett and Kerry struck up a short conversation because Everett thought the pictures of the father and son were so sweet that he wanted to post them to Kerry once Everett got back to the States and they were developed. Kerry's open and friendly nature made it easy to like him immediately. A miner by trade, Carrie was hard and tough on the outside, but an absolute hoot to strike up a conversation with, and his preteen son was just as open and naturally funny. They were a charming pair, and they introduced the Americans to Eric, the biggest croc in the water. Carrie pointed a 3.5-meter-long beast lying on the riverbank out to Everett, telling him how the lizard was a favorite of the locals, just because it was such a big specimen. Carrie even warned the group to keep back from the water's edge, noting that the reptiles were just as fast on land as they were in the water. They ended their conversation so that Carrie and his boy could get back to catching a few more swimmers for the day. But Carrie wasn't having much luck, so he decided to try on the opposite bank instead. On that side, there was a clump of reeds, and he knew by now that his catch liked to hide amongst the grasses that grew right out of the water. Despite his own warnings to the tourists to be careful of getting too close to the water, Carrie stepped right into the current himself. It was just a few feet to get to the other side, and at its deepest point, the water reached up to the 40-year-old's chest. Carrie's son was right behind him, their poles resting on their shoulders as they waded through. Everett spied Eric on the far side of the river. The crocodile was no longer sunning itself on the sandy bank. It had slipped into the shallows the moment that Carrie stepped in. Everett yelled for Carrie to keep an eye out for the crocodile ahead of him, but Eric just waved him off at the same time that his foot slipped on the muddy bottom. Carrie came up spluttering and gagging on the mucky water. His son was about to make a jibe at his father's banana feet, but the laughter went cold on the boy's lips. The lad saw the creature strike from the far bank, slithering its snake-like body toward where Carrie went down. Everett saw it too, and he began to yell for them to turn back. Carrie might have been a daredevil and a joker, but even he realized the impending danger streaking toward him. Pushing his son ahead, the two began to swim as hard as they could, back the way they'd come. Carrie made sure that his boy stayed ahead of him, but he'd lost sight of the beast. It had gone down low, beneath the brown water. When they reached the bank, the face of the loamy wall was too high to simply wade out on. They would have to climb it. The young man began scaling the steep wall, with his father boosting his feet up from below. Just as the boy scuttled onto dry land, turning to grab his father's hand to pull him up too, the boy finally sighted Eric. The animal came out of the water like a cannon, and Carrie reacted instinctively, throwing himself away from the approaching predator and into a drifting log that was floating close by. The croc missed him by just a few inches. Carrie grabbed the log and jammed it at the animal that was approaching again as the rocks from above began raining down. His son was pelting missiles at the creature. It was the only thing the boy could do while the tourists stood watching several yards away in open-mouthed horror. The crocodile dipped below the water again, and when it came up, it was right in Carrie's face. The last thing that Carrie saw was the gigantic maw, full of razor-sharp teeth, and the pink lining of its throat. Then everything went dark. The crowd and Carrie's terrified son watched as the crocodile bit Carrie's head clean off his shoulders. Everett had reached the boy, grabbed him by the shoulders, and dragged him away from the shore. And a good thing, too. The boy, in his panicked state, was about to jump right back into the river to save his father. The group had to drive 5 minutes to the nearest phone, located at a gift shop, to phone the authorities. Within 20 minutes, the authorities were there, but the rest of Carrie's body was nowhere to be seen, nor was the crocodile that had killed him. It didn't take them long to locate it, however. Lying on another stretch of sand, it had dragged Carrie's corpse out and was getting ready to feed. One of the officers fired a round, causing Eric to drop Carrie's body and flee back into the river. But no one knows whether or not that round killed it. The crocodile's body never surfaced. It might have been eaten by other crocs, or it's still out there somewhere. Saltwater crocodiles can live for almost 100 years after all, so there is a very real possibility that Eric is still lurking the murky waters, waiting to bring another innocent swimmer to their terrifying final affliction. Cruising in the depths of the world's oceans are sharks that have earned themselves a reputation as the most dangerous species of sharks, the great white sharks. They are equipped with rows of razor-sharp teeth that are unforgiving during their infamous sneak attacks. When great white sharks are looking to satisfy their large appetites, the last thing you want to do is be in their way. When these ruthless sea creatures decide to strike, they move with such precision and speed that they end up giving their victims no chance to react. Onlookers are left with no other choice than to watch in horror. Such was the case of a man named Randall Fry. A 50-year-old father of one was an ocean enthusiast who loved to spend every waking moment in the expansive oceans. So on 15th of August 2004, same as any other suitable day, Randall could not resist the urge to go to the ocean, and so, together with his longtime diving buddies Cliff Zimmerman and Red Bartley, he heeded the call, and they all set out to the Mendocino coast of abalone. Aboard the 28-foot fishing boat named Dolphin, the trio was bursting with excitement as the cool ocean breeze brushed against their bodies. They combed the turquoise ocean until they all agreed that the sheltered cove at Kybsilla Rock was the perfect spot for abalone hunting. The trio had been at this cove several times before and knew it like the palm of their hands. So, before they could set foot in the cool, alluring waters, they quickly scanned the ocean for sharks or sea lions that the great white sharks were fond of trailing. Once the coast was clear, Randall wasted no time and jumped into the waters. A few minutes later, Cliff joined him. Since abalones could only be caught through free diving in the 15-foot deep waters, all they had on was a wetsuit and mask. While Randy, as they were fond of calling him, was slowly drifting farther away from the boat, Cliff remained close by because he was having trouble with his equipment. For some reason, his mask kept fogging up. Bartley chose to stay behind and keep an eye out for any danger. While on the deck of the boat, he decided to keep himself busy. He took out his fishing rod, hooked the bait, and cast it into the water. Within no time, Bartley had landed a black rock cod before the rest could catch their first abalone. Randy was now 3 feet away from Cliff, who was trying to catch up, but was still struggling with his mask. Afloat, they chatted away and made fun as their heads were bobbing up and down with every breath that the sea took. Randy was yearning to get started with the adventure and couldn't wait a minute longer for Cliff to finish fiddling with his equipment, and so he decided to dive deeper. Not wanting to miss out on the fun, Cliff hurriedly cleaned his foggy mask off and dipped his head into the water to suction his mask onto his head. As his face broke the surface of the water, the unexpected happened. He could feel the pressure of something big passing near him. He stuck his head out of the water and looked around, hoping to see the submarine or speedboat that had just gone past him. In a horrific turn of events, Cliff's eyes were met with a large dorsal fin sticking out of the water. All he knew and needed to know was that the fish was big enough to kill. Before his screams of terror could reach Randall and warn him of the impending danger, the blue ocean suddenly turned crimson. Out of nowhere, the 18-foot great white shark grabbed Randall by his throat and tore his head off, killing him instantly. Copious amounts of blood were seen gushing to the water's surface before both the shark and Randy disappeared into the murkiness of the water. For a moment, Cliff thought that he was right in the middle of a horror movie, but the now strong waves quickly slapped him back to his senses. Cliff, who had spent a good amount of his life on this coast, had heard of many previous shark attacks, but none was fatal. And for a shark attack as fatal as Randy's to happen right before his eyes, it was unbelievable. He could not shake the feeling that a few seconds ago, that could have been him. However, he was still not yet safe from the monstrous creature. He immediately dropped his weight belt and gathered all the energy left in him and frantically made a swim for the boat. He could not tell if the shark was onto him. With his heart about to burst from his chest, he pushed himself beyond his limits, praying and hoping that his body would propel him faster than the water-dwelling monster. Luckily, Bartley was there to yank him out of the water. Bartley, who had heard Cliff screaming at the top of his lungs, looked up only to see a pool of blood spreading on the water's surface. They took a moment and looked around one more time, but they could neither see the shark nor their beloved friend. The blood, too, was gone. Cliff was still trembling and could barely catch his breath. Bartley quickly reached for his radio at the same time, trying to steer the boat, and made a mayday call for help. The duo began their agonizing ride back to the sandy shore. Within the nick of time, helicopters were hovering over the cave at Kybsilla Rocks, looking for Randall's body. Sadly, their efforts were fruitless. As dusk came, the team dispersed. Bartley began his drive back home, but first he needed to make another call. He called Randy's mom and broke the news to her. The following day, in a haunting twist, while recounting their interaction with Randall, Cliff remembered that during one of their usual bunters, Randy had mentioned that a shark might get him in the future. Little did he know that the premonition would come true, and in the most horrific way possible, and that his friends would be left watching in horror. The only comfort that Randall's loved ones got was that earlier that day, a Coast Guard had recovered Randall's lifeless, headless body. Were it not for the wetsuit that had his name on it, it would have taken longer to identify him. But the horror was far from over. On September 8th, 3 weeks after the horrific incident, a beachcomber walking on 10 Mile Beach, north of Fort Bragg, found a head. Upon further investigations, it was identified by the Mendocino County authorities as belonging to Randall. Fatal shark attacks in this area were rare, and when consulted about the reasons for this one, experts strongly believe that the shark may have mistaken Randy for a seal. Others suspected that Bartley's decision to start fishing could have attracted the shark to the area. His family and friends came together to spread his ashes in Maverick's Surf near Half Moon Bay. He spent his better days in the ocean and wanted to rest near it. Many described him as a generous man whose absence would be greatly felt by his community. Randy's colleagues termed him irreplaceable, and his death remains to be a chilly reminder of the unforeseen dangers that are lurking in the alluring waters of the ocean, waiting to bite the next unsuspecting person in the water, bringing them to their tragic, final affliction.